So today for lab, we are not actually doing a lab. Instead, I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of science, talk a bit about the idea of the scientific literature. We are going to assign another homework during the course of the next 45 minutes. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about next week's lab, the enzyme lab. So you have a sense of what we're doing and you've got some basis to write your objective and hypotheses, because it's going to be another one of these hypothesis-driven labs. So before Tuesday next week, you need to have your objective and hypothesis and sources of variability written up for the enzyme lab. So I will be going over that a little bit so you kind of know what's up with that. All right. So scientific method. All right, so what we're going to talk about now is kind of what this whole method of science is about. Like, it's one way of trying to learn about the world around you. There's lots of different ways to try to understand the universe. If you're taking classes in philosophy, they go into ideas of, what is there even to know in the universe, and what are the different ways we can use to try to know what there is to know. There's many conversations we can have about the kind of more meta ideas about this. Instead, what we're going to do is kind of focus in on this one particular tool, this one particular way we have, which is incredibly useful. And particularly today's news cycles is being kind of devalued. We just followed Trump coming into California saying it's nothing to do with climate change. All these fires are just because people aren't taking care of the forests or something. It's like, that could be true, but probably not true. And how do we try to make informed decisions about things like that? So the scientific method, there's different specific definitions you could use. Even one definition I have right here, this guy Arthur Schroller: science is the acquisition of reliable but not infallible knowledge of the real world, including explanations of the phenomena. So it's looking at the world around you and trying to figure out first what is going on, even kind of making your observations, and then trying to make some kind of more elaborated thoughts on why is it like that, what's going on. And there are lots of other ways of going about kind of understanding the world, and there's lots of other things like humanities, literature, mathematics, logic, things like that. They're all important tools, and we'll talk about a little bit. They can all intersect with each other as well. So understanding gained by research. But again, other thing, in the humanities, some of the research you do would not be experiments. It would be go to the library and try to read all of the kind of news articles from a certain time in history and trying to understand what were the social beliefs of that particular time or something, right? So what we are going to be talking about is this very again, kind of narrow definition of research as well, of kind of doing experiments that kind of poke and prod at the physical world around us. And I should say this versus the idea of belief fields. Belief fields are where you just accept something as, true based on, beliefs. This would be like religion, ethics and morality. There is no critical experiment you can do to say abortion is right or wrong, or there is or there isn't a God, or something like that, right? That is something that is kind of off on the side, that is different. You wouldn't use the scientific method. You can use the scientific method, though, to these can inform each other. That's something I like to say explicitly, is that a lot of times people put these things in opposition, like science versus religion or something. And in reality, it's often the case that they help each other. Like if you're trying to figure out, like, do you think abortion is right or wrong? It helps to understand what is pregnancy, what is the development of the fetus, what do you know about how that works, to help you understand what seems right or wrong to you. So you can use science to help you figure out, and refine your beliefs. Belief fields, ethics, morality can play a big role in where do we even go with science. Like, just because we can use scientific techniques to create weapons to annihilate humanity, should we go that direction? I think not. We're learning more and more about how to manipulate human genomes and, edit, make a custom-made human being. Should we go there? Or where could we do that up to a point, maybe to try to get rid of some genetic disease, but then should we use it to try to, like, create Captain America super soldiers, or who knows? It's having a kind of grounding in ethics and all that can play a big role in deciding how you approach science. So you don't want to think about them as like totally independent or separate. They can definitely help inform each other, and they should in general. So, but again, for right now, we are going to focus on this part, the research. And so, empirical. So, relies on observation and experience. So, not value judgments. So for instance, like I like to say, you are never going to use the scientific method to ultimately decide what is the cutest kind of baby animal. Is it a baby bunny, or a little Bambi deer, or a little baby kitten, or maybe, if you've ever seen pictures, a little baby hedgehog. Different people are going to have their own opinions on that. But this scientific method is not going to give you an answer, because that's a value judgment. That's not something you can kind of observe and record and compare. You could ask, change the question a little bit. Like, what kind of baby animal do college or Marin students consider the cutest? And then I could do some, give everybody a bunch of pictures of baby animals and rate them all from 10, the cutest, to 1, not cute at all. And then we could get on average, which animal seems to be the cutest as considered by college and Marin students. We could do that, but it's not telling us which is the cutest, right? Observation, like I can't answer questions if I can't actually get data. If you're, some people think about they've got a guardian angel kind of sitting on their shoulder, helping them out as they go through life. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. This is not going to be the technique that's going to answer that question, because we don't have any way to actually kind of measure that or observe that or, get, there are things that we can't really see that we can get physical evidence of, like, radio waves are invisible, but we have instruments that can detect them, and we can hear the music coming out of what seems like the ether, but we have instruments that can actually observe things that are beyond our normal sensory capacity. But then if we don't have any way to get data on something, we can't use the scientific method. Should say, I'm going to put this in red. No absolute scientific truths. Maybe I should make this bigger. Religion will say this is true or not true. Science will never say this is true. Instead, it's relying on, again, observations and data, and probability is going to be really important. So like a classic example here is like thinking about the sun. The probability that the sun is going to come up tomorrow is really high, right? If I look at the history of all recorded astronomical data and I use all the information we have about how all the celestial bodies work and move and everything, I can say to a super high probability, the sun is going to come up tomorrow morning. And it might not. There's weirdness in physics and everything. Who knows? Maybe due to something we've never understood, the sun just winks out of existence sometime between now and tomorrow, and it doesn't come up tomorrow because the sun doesn't exist anymore. Or who knows? But very high probability it's going to come up tomorrow. Whereas if I said it's going to be sunny tomorrow, I can use my meteorological predictions, but that's a little lower probability. Like if it's not sunny tomorrow, I thought it was going to be sunny, but it ended up being cloudy. It's like, I'm not like that shocked, because I made a prediction. I think it's going to be sunny, but it wasn't. Or there was a huge fire, and all of a sudden, you never got light. We saw that. If a week ago, a week before that, if you were thinking, is this going to be a sunny day? You'd probably say yes. And it definitely wasn't, right? So this idea of probability, super important. And that's where we get into the things like with climate change, right? Climate change, we can't say absolutely that that's what's happening. But we can say, given all the evidence we have, all the modeling we have of how this all works, it's very likely that that's playing an important role in what's happening with the weather changes. It's related to the carbon dioxide that we've been putting into the atmosphere, right? So you always need to really kind of remember that science doesn't give you like an incontrovertible fact, but it also is something you want to pay attention to. And probability, we're going to talk about this in more detail. In fact, when you do experiments, in order to publish them. We've talked about this a little before. You know, the current standard is, before you can publish something as likely real, you have to do the statistical analysis, and it should be at least 95% better likely to be true. So just kind of putting that out there. Probability is super important. Other thing, tests must be reproducible. You know, you can't just do an experiment and get a result and say, well, I know the answer. Right? Because it could have been, who knows what, some one-off. You need to be able to do the same thing again and again and keep getting the same answer before you actually start trusting that you're seeing something real. Or the corollary of that, you often have many different people doing the same thing and all getting the same answers and comparing their answers to say, like, we're starting to really trust this. Like, that's how you start getting from like a hypothesis to a theory. Once things start becoming theories, usually there's more and more evidence that, you know, your guess is actually very much more and more likely to be real, to be true. Other things, can't just use logic. There's like the classic example people always use is Aristotle, who was, he came up with a lot of amazing, awesome stuff. But he also made some, you know, had some pretty, what we now look back at as kind of big, kind of blunderish kind of things. Like one of the famous ones was he, through logical arguments, just decided that women must have fewer teeth than men. You know, and he just left it there. It was so obvious to him from his logical arguments of why that was true. It didn't even make sense to check it out. It obviously had to be true. But he never did the critical experiment. Like, get a bunch of guys, get a bunch of women, kind of count how many teeth they have. You know, if he would have ever done that, he would have realized, oh my God, there's my theory is wrong. So logic is often a good place to start to come up with your hypothesis, but you can't just leave it there and just assume it's true. There's a lot of things that are counterintuitive. There's a lot of times you'll have something that really makes sense logically, and when then you go in and look at the real world, you find, oh my God, that's not that at all. There's something I wasn't taking into account that actually is going on here. So you can't just use logic. What's another thing I can mention? Interdisciplinary studies. More and more, most of the interesting questions do not stay confined to one particular kind of discipline. Like, you know, we're taking a biology class supposedly, and we haven't got out of chemistry, right? You know, so this idea, if you're trying to understand neuroscience, you actually have to understand, you know, chemistry. And if you want to understand like how the nervous system works, you actually have to understand all the other systems as well. And if you're actually trying to understand that, you're actually probably gonna have to go into ecology, because a lot of things affecting our nervous system are different chemicals that end up in the environment as a result of different like industrial processes, or, you know, so a lot of the interesting questions that we ask go across multiple disciplines. You know, my graduate work was in bioengineering, like trying to understand how the ear processes, you know, sound. I did a lot of work using tools from engineering, just looking at signal processing, looking at just how does a more generic system, process information that would be just as useful to trying to understand a radio transmitter or something, but it was also really useful to trying to understand how the nervous system is processing information. So this idea of interdisciplinary studies is useful to keep in mind. A lot of science isn't confined into a particular field, even though it's easier when it is. We can talk about basic versus applied research. Does anybody know what we mean by that? What do I mean when I say basic research versus applied research?
The decision should be based on the prior experiments that has been proven right.
No, so that's what we'll talk about. That will be kind of like this idea of kind of deductive reasoning and developing your hypotheses. So we'll talk about that kind of thing. But this is something a little different. Anybody? So basic research, when we talk about basic research, we're talking about people asking questions just because they're curious. Like when I did my graduate work, trying to understand how the ear is, extracting information from sound, it's just because we want to know how the heck does it do it. It's like kind of it doing amazing amounts of signal processing and like, how are you doing it with these little cells and membranes? But there was not a bigger reason in terms of, applied research is when you actually have some problem you're trying to solve that's more practical, like in medicine. Like, somebody has diabetes and you're doing research trying to cure the disease, or people have some, it's usually about kind of medical research, things like that. So, or practical research, like in engineering, I'm trying to come up with a way to have faster, internet on my telephone. So I'm coming up with new ways to send signals through the air and, come up with 5G or whatever, right? So applied research is when there is an actual goal. It's kind of goal oriented. Basic is more kind of driven by kind of the core curiosity of the world. That being said, these often interact a lot. There's a famous quote, I don't know if it's famous to me, by Carl Sagan that I can read because I like it. So this is Carl Sagan. He was like, in addition to going billions and billions and all that, Maxwell wasn't thinking of radio, radar, and television when he first scratched out the fundamental equations of electromagnetism. Newton was not dreaming of spaceflight or communication satellites when he first understood the motion of the moon. Röntgen wasn't contemplating medical diagnosis when he investigated a penetrating radiation so mysterious he called it X-rays. Madame Curie wasn't thinking of cancer therapy when she painstakingly extracted minute amounts of radium from tons of pitchblende. Fleming wasn't planning on saving the lives of millions with antibiotics when he first noticed a circle free of bacteria around a growth of mold. Watson and Crick weren't imagining the cure of genetic diseases when they puzzled over the X-ray diffractometry of DNA. So just kind of the idea, just because sometimes people will say like, why fund basic research? Why, if we got a limited amount of funds, let's put it into something that's going to help somebody. But a lot of times just kind of understanding things leads you places that are really going to ultimately be amazing, even though you could never guess where it's going to be when you first start. That being said, a lot of research is applied, particularly like in, if you're in a company, if you're working at Genentech, you need to ultimately be making drugs that you can sell, or else your company's not going to stay alive. Um, so a lot of times applied research is more likely to occur in industry. Basic research is more likely to occur in universities. That being said, universities come up with stuff that gets leveraged into applied. You know, the people who work in applied research are still at their heart are usually scientists or curious. Like if you, one of my good friends leads a lab at Genentech, he gets to spend, you know, a lot of his time he spends on more focused questions that are going to hopefully result in therapeutics. But he also gets a lot of leeway to just ask basic questions about cells, because those often lead to things that ultimately are going to be useful. And minimally, they also just make it fun to be a scientist because you get to ask interesting questions and follow interesting things. Like at least at Genentech, they send their scientists off to basic research conferences to be part of the community of basic research as well as applied. The the big the buzzword these days in both academic and applied, this idea of translational research. You know, translational means you can take something that's basic, but then figure out how does it apply in a more practical way. So translational, like if you're trying to get funding, you know, it's a good idea to make sure that word translational is somewhere in your proposal, because that's something people like to see. It's kind of like equity in education. Translational would be the thing in research in terms of like, I mean, both a good thing, but also kind of something that people are really jazzed about. Um, so, um, should mention scientists are humans, humans that have biases, humans who have um, you know, jobs that they're trying to maintain by having publications, or people who have, you know, so there's a lot of weirdness, the fact that humans are humans, but we want science to be about some deeper truth about what's going on. So there's a variety of things in place to try to deal with the fact that scientists are humans. One thing, you know, and people can, you design, sometimes just the way you design an experiment might lead to the answer you expected. This happens a lot in survey questions as well. People will ask a question in such a way to make it very likely that the person's going to answer it the way that you want them to answer it. I should have had, I'll give you some examples later. There's some really hilarious examples of, you know, people will present the results of some survey and you'll say, whoa, that's surprising that people answered that way. But then you actually see the actual question they answered. And the question was written in this really weird way that really made it hard to answer it any other way. So people will also have biases. They'll look like even when I grade in general, you know, especially after a while, you know, you start getting a sense of, oh, this student seems to do well very often. This student seems to struggle more often. And so whether I like it or not, I start getting expectations like, oh, let's, you know, this person, I bet you this answer, I'm going to read this question to this answer here. And before I even read it, I'm kind of expecting it's probably going to be right. Or like, I hope it's right because this person often gets confused. Right. So that would be a bias. And then you run into trouble. Like, let's say the question, they answered it and it's not exactly right, but it's not exactly wrong. So now we get into partial credit territory. And now that's getting into this weird place. And if I know this person, probably if they didn't quite get it, but they know most of the stuff. They probably know it. I'm going to give them, more points on it because it's not quite right, but it's close. And then another person might have the same kind of partial credit answer. And it's somebody that I have as more of a bias of, this person's always kind of confused. And then I'm going to like, okay, they'll get partial credit, but not as many points because I don't think they really got it. So that's bad. I don't want to do that. So in general, as much as possible, when I'm grading, I try to grade without knowing who the person is. So every question that I grade is just its own thing. We'd call this kind of blind. I try to be blind to what the data, where the data is coming from. So I can't use my biases to influence how I interpret the data. This is something that ends up being a big part of experimental design. We're going to talk in a few moments about the idea of a double blind experiment, where you don't know whose data you're looking at. And your subjects don't even know which group they're in the experiment because of placebo effects. Just because you think you're getting a medicine might affect the results, even if it's just your belief. So we're going to talk about this idea that we have to deal with the fact that humans have biases. So there's a lot of scientists double checking each other. So so maybe I'll say that. This is where we're going to get into the idea of peer review. When we start talking about the idea of the literature in a little bit, the scientific reports based, that report on what their experiments had. For the more reputable journals, you can't just write something and publish it. Instead, you do your experiment, you write it up, you send it, and then it goes into peer review. And you have a lot of other scientists that are familiar with this kind of work, that are in the field. They look at what you did. They look, did you make any mistakes? They look, did you have any blind spots where you left something out? You should have been checking this or thinking about this, but you didn't, because you're so convinced about what the answer should be. You didn't even think you should have looked at something else. So this peer review process is one of the ways that scientists try to hold each other accountable. And typically when you get your thing back, you usually have to revise. Usually the people come back and they say like, you really need to do some more control experiments, or you really left out some important things that you need to bring into your discussion, or this or that. So there's this iterative process before things actually get out there into the world as like scientific information. Again, this peer review is an important part of it, and that's to help control for the fact that humans have biases and humans have, and sometimes, the reality of a career in science is the more publications you get, the more likely you are to get tenure. So you want to get more things done faster, and you might cut corners, or, and not because you're a bad person, but because the system is kind of boxing you into a corner where you don't want to lose your job. So it gets kind of tricky, just kind of putting out there. The real world of academia has some of the weirdness that the rest of the world has, as well, including all the stuff about equity and race and stuff that's been coming up in the greater society. It's caused academia to take a long, hard look at itself in terms of all of that. That's actually a huge issue around bias around sexuality. There's all sorts of data that's coming out on how women scientists become marginalized even when people don't even realize they're doing it. So there's a lot of people have been trying more and more to kind of hold, academic or hold scientific endeavors and scientific research accountable in the same ways kind of our greater society is holding itself accountable. Let's see, what else do I have here? So let's talk about a bit about experimental design. So the basic idea here is, as we've seen, there's usually an independent and dependent variable. In the basic experimental design is we're going to have two groups. We're going to have what we call the control group. We're going to have the experimental group. And these basically, ideally, differ only in the independent variable. So the example I used the very beginning of the semester about drinking coffee affecting your exam grades. My question is, how does coffee consumption affect your performance on your exams? Then my variable that I'm looking at is caffeine consumption. Whoops. This group has no caffeine. I'm misspelling caffeine again. But this should be the only difference. And then I'll be able to check out what is the average test scores in this group versus this group. And then I can see if there's some correlation between the test scores and the caffeine consumption. But this idea of differing only in the independent variable, that's where the sources of variability comes up. Like, what other things might affect test scores? And what other things might affect test scores?
How much they studied.
How much you've been studying. So let us try to make sure, and in that we could say in general, like their GPA is probably a good measure of kind of how good of a student they are and how much they study in general. So I should say the average GPA of these two groups needs to be matched. So I don't accidentally get one group that's just a bunch of like students that really never try and a bunch of total kick-ass students that are always overachievers. And then sure, this group got a higher overall score on their test, but it didn't have to do with the caffeine. It's just, they were just, these really go-getter students, and this group just randomly, accidentally ended up with a bunch of people who don't care. But if I say both groups have the same average GPA, I've at least to some degree controlled for that source of variability. So if somebody says, well, how do you know that they just weren't better students than them? I can say, because I made sure before we started the experiment. Right? So that's an example of kind of controlling for all the sources of variability. So all of those variables that might affect your dependent variable that are not the main variable you're looking at, you need to, as much as possible, you want to match these in everything that might affect your dependent variable, in this case, test scores. We should probably make sure that both groups are getting, just about the same amount of sleep on average, that there's not one group that's more sleep deprived than the other. Probably make sure that both groups have the same basic resources, access to tutoring and whatever else that they need. Make sure, so as much as possible, you try to make sure the only difference between the groups is this independent variable. So then if I do the experiment and this group has appreciably higher test scores than this group, I can be kind of confident that it probably is the caffeine that made the difference. So now we have to add the next layer, that level of blinding and all that. So one thing that we have to worry about is the idea of the placebo effect, which I'm sure everybody has heard of. And just because it might not be a physiological real thing, it is a real thing. It makes a difference. When people believe something is real, it can actually lead to physiological effects. You can actually have you can put somebody in hypnotic trances where you can actually drill into their teeth. So it's obviously affecting their pain pathways. You can have people drink in some non-alcoholic beer that they really think is alcoholic beer, and they start slurring their speech and tripping over themselves. You can have people taking pills that are purely sugar that they think are supposed to be relieving pain, and it will relieve pain. So you really want to make sure, just because they take a pill and it makes them feel better, doesn't mean it was the pill that did it. It might be that it's this placebo effect. We're going to talk more about this when we get to the nervous system. But there's a major connections between your psychological state and your physiological state. Just being stressed, you can have measurably lower white blood cell counts and be more susceptible to infections. So this psychological state can lead to physiological changes in your body. So you need to take this into account. For this one, you need to make sure that somebody doesn't know, are they in the experimental group or the control group? It could be that, the people, let's say if I just made it so I'm going to give people free coffee before, let's say we weren't in COVID times, and I'm going to just, or even maybe COVID, I'm sending half the class little like gift certificates to Pete's. So you're drinking lots of coffee, and half the class, you don't get any. And then I check, how do people do on the exams? And it's like, oh, the people who all got the free gift cards to Pete's did better on their exam. But it could be that, well, they know that they're kind of in this special group, so they're thinking they're probably going to do better. Or maybe they just feel more special. Wow, he gave us like free gift cards. I feel more engaged in this class. And then the other group is like, what a lame ass. He's like giving those people free coffee gift cards, and we don't get anything. And why should I even like care about this class if he doesn't care about me? It could be that's what's going on, and it's not about caffeine. They're just not doing as well on the exams because they're pissed that they were left behind in the free gift card giveaway. So this idea of having, you want to blind, let me put it on this, we're going to talk about a double blind. Double blind, subjects do not know if they are control or experimental group. That way, we're not going to have to deal with the placebo effect. And it really can make a big difference. I'll show you in a few moments how dramatic it can be. And then the experimenters don't know either. So we call it unblinding. You unblind the experiment at the end. Like for instance, the ones that I've been involved with using MDMA for, in conjunction with therapy for people with anxiety. Neither the subjects knew whether they were getting a placebo or the actual drug, and the psychiatrists that were doing the therapy with them did not know either. Until after you got all the data, you have independent raters that are trying to decide, how are they, because a lot of these scales, like trying to assess somebody's level of anxiety, you're biased. If I'm just thinking, like, this person seems a little more relaxed because I know that they are in the group that I think got the drug and should be more relaxed, that might affect the results. So as much as possible, you try to get all the main data before anybody knows who was in what group. And then if you see actual correlations with your variable, you can trust that it had to do with the actual variable and not with the biases or placebo effect. We've, in the class, when we used to meet in person, we would do research projects just in the different groups in the class. And people would do, like, for instance, do something. Can people tell the difference between organic and inorganically grown produce? But I would blind the experiment. So I would be like the independent person off on the side. I would prepare all the little pieces of apple or banana or this or that. And the experimenters would just know these are apple A, these are apple B, these are apple C. And then the subjects would try the different apples and talk about what they thought they were or what blah, blah, blah. And it wasn't until all the data was gathered and the basic results are tallied up that I would tell the experimenters, oh yeah, apples A were the inorganic, apple B were organic, so like that. People have done things like, if you wanted to tell, can people tell Coke from Pepsi from RC Cola or something, you'd be similar. I would just give you sodas labeled like A, B, C, and D, and you would have to do the experiment and people would have to kind of guess what was what. But it's not until all the data was gathered so that you would even know as an experimenter what was what. Because otherwise you might kind of nudge them. You kind of know what it is and you don't even mean to, but you're kind of subconsciously encouraging them, like, isn't that refreshing? Or so, I don't know. Like, it doesn't that like make you want to feel teach the world to sing or something? Or, you give them hints that you don't even know you're giving them. So double blind. And so to give you a sense, this is something that I think is useful to think about. Why you need, first, why you have to take the placebo effect seriously. Why you have to set things up in this kind of experimental form. And also, oh, I think I got rid of it. And why probability is important. So I'm going to show you the, let me find it here. I'm going to show you the results of the clinical trials for Tagamet. It's just a medicine that people took for heartburn. So let me find it here. Blah, 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 blah. It's right here. Okay, and let me share this. I can actually, where to go? Hold on. Back. Oh, there it is. What's going on? Okay, hold on. I can see it on my screen, but oh, there it is. Okay, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Oh, dag nabbit. There it is. I'm going to zoom in on this. Now it's zooming in. Okay, sorry about that. So what I'm going to show you here is the result of these clinical trials, which are basically saying, here's where the studies, and let me do my annotation here. I'm gonna be able to draw. So here, let's look at study A first. Cimetidine, this is the actual drug, the Tagamet. Placebo, the people got some sort of a sugar pill. And this here, this is the percent of heartburn episodes relieved. And if you take a look, 75% of the people who got the drug, had relief. But if you look here, half of the people who just took the sugar pill also reported relief. So there's a difference. You are more likely to get relief if you took this drug, but you are also quite likely to get relief if you just took a sugar pill. And if you spin it on around the other way, a quarter of the people who actually took the drug didn't get relief, whereas half the people who took a sugar pill did get relief. This other study, study B, is kind of similar. Here about 2/3 of the people who took the drug got relief, but 1/3 of the people who took the drug did not get relief. And here again, over half the people who just took a sugar pill did get relief. So this is the evidence you need to package and sell this and put it on the shelf at CVS as a heartburn medicine. But that doesn't mean just because you take that medicine, it's going to relieve your heartburn. It means that, it's more likely than a sugar pill to relieve your heartburn, but not necessarily that much more likely. And it also means, like, if you did nothing, you were also probably pretty likely to just get relief anyway without taking anything, or just taking something that you believed helped, but would have been probably just, why not just eat like one of like a Smarties or a Now and Later if sugar thing is going to do it, it probably tastes better. So just kind of giving you an idea of what this data really looks like. Again, placebo, the fact that half the people who just got placebo got relief. And again, just because something is clinically proven to relieve heartburn doesn't mean that you take a pill and it's going to relieve your heartburn. So just kind of giving you a sense of the probability thing. So does that make sense? And it's also, part of the reason there's going to be so many different meds for the same indication is everybody's physiology is kind of different. When we're going to get to the very end of the semester and talk about, sexual reproduction, which gives you all this genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is not just in like what you look like. Sure, some people have curly hair or straight hair or, whatever, but there's a lot of genetic diversity on the metabolic level. Having a ion channel that happens to allow things to go through faster or slower, or pump faster or slower, or having enzymes that work more or less efficient, and which means the same drug you put into their body might have a slightly different effect. So there's a whole bunch of drugs for heartburn or for depression or for blood pressure or for this or that. And each of those drugs might have a more or less probable chance of helping one particular person or not, or it might actually end up having like really bad side effects on one person, but not on another. So the reality is any particular drug is probably not going to have the same effect on everybody because everybody's physiology and metabolism are all kind of unique in certain ways. All right, so I'm going to end our talk about scientific method, just talking a little bit more about hypotheses, and we'll take a little break. Wait, hold on, let's see. So I think it's worth talking briefly about this since I keep asking you to come up with hypotheses. It's worth talking a little more formally about how do people come up with hypotheses? So what are some of the ways that you've been doing it?
Finding correlations between dependent and independent variables.
Well, so this is your guess of what that is going to be.
Yes, exactly, I guess.
How do you come up with that guess?
Using logic.
So one is using logic. So we can use deductive logic. This is where you take something you already know, and then you use a logical argument to figure out, well, what would that imply? It's like, well, I know that caffeine is a central nervous system stimulant, and stimulants make you awake and more alert. And if you're alert and more awake, you're going to be able to study longer and more efficiently. And people who study longer and more efficiently do better on exams. So I think caffeine is going to be correlated with better test scores. That would be deductive reasoning, deductive logic. Start with something that you know as being real or being true, and then use some logical argument of what that would lead to. And again, you can't still do the experiment, like I said, with that example of Aristotle and the teeth or whatever. You can't just assume, okay, I've reached my logical conclusion and I'm done. Because there's a lot of times when what's actually happening is not logically making sense when you first think about it. There's another thing called inductive reasoning. What is inductive logic, inductive reasoning? Anybody? You ever do like inductive proofs in math? Everybody's quiet. Okay, induction. So this is, you generalize, kind of anecdotal observations. So anecdote is kind of a one-off. Like I kind of notice, oh, Cassie was doing well on her exam, and every time I see her in the video, she seems to have like a cup of coffee by her. And Marissa as well. Every time I see her on the screen, she's drinking coffee. And there's Mason drinking his big mug there. And Mason also kicks butt on his exams. So, and there's Maria as well. And then I look, and again, I'm just saying this for, I'm not saying anything about you. I'm just, for example, like Sari is not drinking coffee, and Sari didn't do so well. And Taylor also didn't do so well. And they're not drinking coffee. So like, I'm thinking maybe there's something to this. It's like, I just see these, my observations are the people who drink coffee a lot seem to be doing better. The people who aren't, I don't see with the coffee mugs on the screen, don't seem to be doing as well. So I'm going to have a hypothesis. I'm going to generalize that. Okay, in general, people who drink more coffee do better, and people who don't drink as much coffee don't do as well. And now I'm going to do an experiment, though, to see if my experiment actually supports that hypothesis. Right? You know, or like you're driving along and someone almost hits your car, and it's like, what an idiot. Oh my God, they're on their cell phone. And then it's like another while later, you're like almost in another accident. It's like, that guy's also on his cell phone. And you're like thinking like, it really seems like people who are on their cell phones are a menace on the road and are dangerous drivers and more likely to get into an accident. But that would be, you know, this inductive reasoning to come up with your hypothesis, saying, I think people on cell phones while they're driving are not as safe in terms of driving. But then you'd have to do a test and check to see if that's really supported. So this makes it look like scientists are very logical, you know, inductive logic, deductive logic. You know, a lot of times though, people come up with hypotheses just because they get a gut feeling. You know, sometimes intuition comes in. People who have been working with the same topic for long enough, sometimes just like, I'm pretty sure I think I know what's going on here. Let's check. There's a few like classic examples like Kekule, the guy who discovered that benzene was a aromatic ring. They knew it was 6 carbons. They knew the chemical formula, but they didn't know how the bonding worked and how it was put together. And supposedly he had a dream of like an Ouroboros, like the snake who's eating its own tail, and like kind of woke up and like had this idea like, oh my God, it's a ring form. How the guy, like another classic example when people talk about intuition, the guy who came up with a sewing machine was trying to figure out how to make, you know, normally you think of the needle, so a needle pulling thread, right? And they're coming up with how can we make this an automatic machine? And they were having he was having trouble making it happen. And supposedly he had some dream of getting like caught by savages in the jungle and they're all poking at them with the spears. And he noticed like all of their spears that they're poking at had this little hole in the very front of the spear. And like in the morning, he like the hole in the front of the needle. It was like the big breakthrough he needed to like design this sewing machine where the hole was actually on the front of the needle instead of like on the back or the middle of the needle. So, you know, that kind of thing. People often come up with stuff because they are just, you know, so steeped in something. We're going to talk about this more when we get into the idea of different kinds of learning. There's explicit learning, but there's also implicit learning. There are things where people learn stuff, it actually affects their decision making, but they don't actually know. It's like where you don't know what you know. You've made observations, your nervous system, your brain has actually started to understand patterns around you. But if I asked you explicitly, like, do you see these patterns? You'd say, I don't see these patterns. But in reality, if you test the person and watch their behavior, you realize, okay, they wouldn't behave this way unless they actually did see these patterns, but they're unconscious that they see these patterns. So we're going to talk about that when we get to the nervous system a little later. So intuition, like, you know, your nervous system, your brain can actually make connections, see patterns that you are not consciously aware that you know even. The last one I'll put here, it's always that kind of fun word, serendipity. Most people have heard serendipity. What's serendipity?
By chance.
Yes, like sometimes people call it like the happy accident. Again, the classic example of this is Alexander Fleming and the discovery of penicillin. He had Petri dishes where he was culturing bacteria, and a bunch of, some of them had gotten contaminated with mold, and there's getting ready to throw them out because the experiment's ruined. And it could have just ended there. It's like if he was not as observant and kind of creative, he would say the experiment's ruined, throw it out and start the experiment again. But instead noticed, whoa, wherever there's these little growths of mold, there's a little zone where no bacteria are growing at all. So he's like, it really looks like there's something in this mold that's killing the bacteria in the adjacent zone. And that was the beginning of, the discovery of penicillin, which was made by that penicillium mold. His lab was also the one that figured out lysozyme, which we're going to talk about as antimicrobial compound that's in most of your body secretions, like in your saliva and in your mucus and snot and your tears. There's this antimicrobial protein that breaks apart the cell walls in bacteria. And the way they found it was actually somebody looking at some bacteria under the microscope on a slide, and somebody had some snot come out of their nose and land on the slide. And, it was like, I wonder what that looks like. And it's like, whoa, it's lysing the bacteria. There's something in my snot that's making the bacteria break apart. And that's where they discovered that there's this antimicrobial lysozyme that's in our secretions. So, so science isn't all about, we know what we're gonna find and we're looking for it and we find it. A lot of the stuff that we find out in the real world, we could have never imagined was there in the first place. So you have to kind of be open to kind of good fortune, like something comes across your table and you're like, what is that? Or what's going on there? And just be curious and follow it down. Because it's not all about this logical, come up with a deductive or inductive, hypothesis or something. So, any questions? So this is not so much stuff you're going to be tested on explicitly, but it's useful to kind of think about the bigger picture of, how, here is your book, and you're going to read all this stuff in there. It's like, how do we know? How do we figure this out? It's through this process over many, many years, and asking good questions and doing experiments and interpreting the data. And how come this book here is more up to date and better than a book from 20 years ago? It's because, it's about probability. We get the data and here's our best interpretation of what's going on to a certain probability. And as we get more data or better tools, we get a better explanation. And now this is likely what's happening, right? So science is a kind of a living process. That's part of why it's fun for me to be a scientist, right? Because it's not like we know it all and we're done. It's like you keep getting better ideas of what you do know. Wow. So is everybody, that was weird. I just got kicked off and then back into Zoom. Is everybody still
Yeah,
there?
that happened to me too.
Happened to me here.
All right, but we're back. So that is the universe telling us we should take a break. So it's 10, let's take a break till noon. When we come back at noon, I'm going to talk briefly about the literature, then talk about enzymes, and then we'll break for the weekend. So back at noon. All right, so we're going to do now is talk about the scientific literature. So, one of the things I mentioned before is most of the questions that are interesting are really big. And even looking at one little piece of a big problem is incredibly difficult and time intensive. And the only way that science moves forward is by having lots of different people all working on the same problem from different kind of viewpoints, and then sharing what they know and building off of each other's work. Like the famous saying by Isaac Newton, it was like, if I have seen Father, it is only because I am standing on the shoulder of giants, right? It's like everybody kind of acknowledges that you're not making this all up on your own. Somebody else kind of paved the way for you to, even if you've come up with something awesome, that's only possible because somebody else did something before that you could then extend. So that being said, there has to be good ways to share all of everybody's work. And that is, there's two big ways. One way is through scientific conferences, which now have gotten much weirder because everything's online. But they're trying their best to do online conferences. And then the other one is through the literature, through scientific publications. And there are thousands and thousands of specialized journals that report on scientific findings. And some of them are more reputable than others. In fact, in this world of science, there's this idea of like kind of top tier journals and second tier journals, which are harder to get into, or, it's a bigger feather in your cap if you get into one of these top tier journals, are more likely to only report really amazing results versus like, that's kind of interesting, but, it's not as sexy as a really amazing result. Scientific publication has also changed pretty dramatically just in the last many years, because of accessibility to the information. It used to be when you published something in a journal, then the only people who could read that journal are the people who subscribed to that journal. But then it's actually incredibly expensive to subscribe to these really specialized journals. And the only people who can subscribe to them are like large institutions. And if you personally want an article from one of these, in the past, you'd have to go to a library and copy it. And even now, if you try to get an article from one of these, they'll charge you like $30 for a PDF file, which is just ridiculous. So part of the response to that was kind of open source journals, which are becoming more and more popular, where the people actually, it's still kind of a reputable journal, but instead of you give them your stuff and they publish it and then they get money from the readers, you have to pay to get your article published. And then, but once it's published, it's available to anybody to download for free. So that's more common now. But anyway, the system keeps kind of moving. There are also a lot of journals out there that are kind of lame too. Like I've seen more and more of that, like, some kind of Mickey Mouse kind of journal, which just so somebody feels like they're publishing in something, and you realize like, actually, I don't even know who the publisher is of this journal. And there's obviously no peer review because the abstract is full of typos. And so you have to be careful. Just because something's in a scientific journal, you should check how reputable that scientific journal is, because it's kind of like a website, right? You can literally go on websites that just tell you the most bizarre things, because, so you want to make sure you're getting a source of information from a reputable I'm much more likely to trust something I read in the Washington Post than I read on, I don't know, like they're all gonna kill you.com or something, whatever. I don't know if that exists even, but so when we talk about the scientific literature, there's different levels that we should talk about. And the first are the primary references. So primary references, these are published in peer-reviewed journals. And these are by the actual people who did the research. So this is the highest level of actually trusting that whatever you're seeing is real, because it's, there's no levels of kind of, the game of telephone, like they're saying they found this. It's like, no, I found this. So there's not a chance that there's going to be this misunderstanding. Also, it's in a peer-reviewed journal, so other scientists have looked at what they wrote and at least to a first degree have said, this isn't bullshit. This seems like it's well done and is something that was done according to a responsible scientific technique. So they will actually show you their data. They'll give you the graphs of their actual data so you can look at it. You can decide, do you make the same conclusions that they did? And it's not always the case you will. Like we do journal clubs in lab all the time, and we discuss different papers that are published. And it's not uncommon for the consensus in the lab to be like, oh, this is kind of interesting, but I don't actually totally believe their conclusions because I think we could interpret it a different way and it would make just as much sense from looking at their data. Or yes, you could say that, but they never did a control experiment that would make sure that it's not this other thing. And from what we know, it might be that other thing. So it's nice to have a primary reference because it gives you more control to decide whether you trust it or not, as opposed to somebody just writing something in a news article saying scientists found X, and it's like you either believe him or not. You don't have anything to go to see like, well, let me see, do I believe this? Let me see what they actually found and how they drew their conclusions. So primary references. In your homework assignment that you're going to be doing that I'm about to give you before we leave, you're going to have to find primary references. We're going to have a question. The question in this one's going to be about the effect of oat bran on your cardiovascular health. It's like, Quaker Oats will say like, eat oats, for heart health. And you're like, is that just trying to sell me some oats, or is there actual scientific evidence that that's real? You're going to go into the scientific literature, try to find these primary references, people who've actually done experiments and can report, this is what I found between the relationship between like oat bran and, the incidence of heart disease and stuff like that. And it's not just like some like, wellhealth.com, like oats are good for you, believe me, right? So that is primary reference. The next one are secondary references. These are review articles. These are really important for you as well. So these are review articles. So it's looking at a number of different studies in a particular topic. So like you're interested in, oats and diet, there's probably a whole bunch of individual reports, and sometimes it's nice to have somebody who's responsible kind of summarize what seems to be the general story of this topic right now at our current time. A review article is written by usually a scientist who's familiar in the field, so can actually write stuff responsibly, but takes a step back and talks about what is the bigger picture of a lot of different studies. Like, many studies have found this, although there's been a few studies that have shown the opposite and blah, blah, blah. So review articles are going to be your friend, because sometimes there's too many individual primary references. There's going to be a few that you need to use these, but it's also nice to find the review articles which kind of help you get a handle on the larger body without having to look at every single article. There are certain journals that are just about publishing review articles, like Trends in Neuroscience is a good journal, but it doesn't actually have original research. It has really well done review articles about particular topics in neuroscience. When you're trying to find review articles, you can use the keyword. You can use the keyword review. That's often a keyword in searches if you're looking for review articles. Review. Next, we get to tertiary references. This would be like textbooks. This is not where you should go for really your information that you're going to put in a more formal write-up. D. Unglaub Silverthorne, she knows a lot about a lot of things, but she's not an expert in everything. The other book we use, Sherwood, Laurel Lee Sherwood, I know in particular, she is an expert in urinary function. Like I would really, trust a lot what she says in her chapter about the kidneys. When you get into the other chapters, she's doing her best, but I wouldn't trust it as much because, nobody can be an expert in everything. So textbooks are a good place to go for kind of more general backgrounds on things. But when you're actually trying to really have something solid to support your argument, that's typically not where you're going to go. That's not considered as solid of a source as a review article or definitely a primary reference. And then you can just get into like newspapers and stuff. This gets even more ridiculous. You have to be really careful. This is in this world of the whole Trump thing of like trying to pretend like nothing is real and you can't trust, everything's fake. I have to be careful about trying to make you not trust newspapers and stuff, but you still want to know that people writing articles, often have biases, often are trying to sell papers, are trying to kind of sex things up so it sounds more interesting to read. So you wouldn't want to like read something in the newspaper, especially about biology, and just say, I know everything there is to know. You'd want to go deeper and look at what actually happened in the actual research. I have a couple of examples that I'll show you, just that they're from, I actually subscribe to the Chronicle. I like the Chronicle. No, I'm not hating on the Chronicle. I'm just going to show you a couple of things though that the Chronicle has published over the past few years, that make you realize you don't want to just use the daily paper as your way of understanding like nuanced scientific research. So here, this one always cracks me up. Let me, surprising results of impotence study. This was from a number of years ago. If you read this thing, read this article, again, first there's a title, Surprising Results of Impotence Study. Largest study of impotence since Kinsey report has found about half of American men have experienced the problem to varying degrees. It's federally financed study, blah, 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 asks about sexual potency. So, and again, by this point, everybody's really busy. There's all these other things. So they've got, okay, I got it. Surprising results, half of Americans are experiencing it. They go on to the next thing. If you stick with the article until you get to the third paragraph, it's like, oh, because the survey was regional rather than national, its findings cannot be extrapolated to the entire country. All right, then how come they said half of American men have experienced the problem, right? So there's this huge disconnect already. It's like, according to this line, you can't extrapolate this small study to all America, but the headline first sentence says that it's about half of all of America, right? So there's so that just kind of gives you a sense of, you got to be careful. Like when you are interested in this, you kind of go on and then you find who is the author. And we're going to talk about how to find the actual article, and then read the actual article, read the abstract of the actual study, and then make your own decision about what it actually says. Don't use the newspaper article as your like last word. I mean, another one that cracked me up. We'll do this one now. Hold on. This one, pot, bad for middle-aged hearts. And we go here now and we're gonna, again, you read the title, pot, bad for middle-aged hearts. Doctors already know it's bad for the heart and can be a trigger for now. They've determined smoking marijuana in middle age, bigger risk factor. First hour after smoking, the risk 5 times greater than blah, blah, blah. Adding marijuana to the growing list of pleasures may trigger. So you're reading this and you're like, whoa, kind of scary. And then again, moving on. Again, if you get to the third line, it always seems like the third line is where they kind of start getting more honest with these things. It's like, risk is about the same as the risk we found for physical exertion, a little higher than sex. It's like, this could be pot as bad for the heart as exercise or sex for a middle-aged person, which is ridiculous, right? So it's like, it's worth knowing that pot can increase cardiovascular stress, but the way it's being kind of presented here, is kind of disingenuous. So you really want to be careful when you're using the newspaper as a place to get your information, because they're going to try to they're going to try to sensationalize it to some degree. And again, you can just go back. Murray Mittelman, you can actually find this article and then read what does it actually say, and then make your own decision. So those are like the 3 layers. The way you actually can find the papers is usually using Medline. So there are different ways to find these scientific articles. In the past, it used to be a pain in the butt going to the libraries because only the libraries at the large universities could actually afford to buy or subscribe to these journals. And then there was a big index, but it was all in paper. I literally would go through tons and tons of looking through stuff. It was then it became online, but it was only online at libraries that could afford the big databases. And now it's one of the things that's actually the federal government that's done that's been pretty amazing is the National Library of Medicine has made the kind of database to search all of the medical research available for free for everybody. You're not necessarily going to get the full papers for free for everything, but you can at least see what papers exist and usually minimally just get an abstract, get a summary of what it says. And the big database is called Medline. So I'm gonna show you that right now. So I'm gonna share. So the way I usually find it is just go into Google, and if you just type Medline, it shows up. There's Medline. Wait, Medline, not medline.com. What? That's new. Well, not, so PubMed is called PubMed now. Take it back. It used to be called Medline database, but now that it's public, call it PubMed. All right, here it is. So PubMed, this is National Library of Medicine, which is part of the National Center for Biotechnology Information. There are also lots of other databases that are really cool, but we're going to stick with PubMed for now. So PubMed, it's this kind of simple little search bar here, but it basically searches millions and millions of scientific articles in thousands and thousands of journals and brings them up. So like, for instance, let's say I wanted to know, does Red Bull give you wings? I want to know, does energy drink actually help improve your athletic performance? Is there actually scientific data that shows that? I could go, let's put it in, energy drink. I don't know, athletic. Coming up with your search terms is going to be really a big part of this skill, is figuring out what is a good search term. Oh, so here's some stuff's coming up. So what it gives you a title. Once you see a title, then what you can do is you can click on that, and then you can usually get an abstract. So this would be interesting: acute effects of energy drink on short-term maximal performance, reaction time, psychological parameters, insights from a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled crossover trial. Let's take a look at it. It's like, here's the authors. And actually, this is a free article. So if I wanted to, I could actually get the full text for free. The abstract always gives you in a nutshell, what was the experiment about? What did they do? What was their objective and their methods and their conclusions? Their conclusions, they found significant correlations between performance and reaction times, la, la, la. All right, so this looks like Red Bull gave them wings. So we could go back and look, and just because one study has a result doesn't mean all of them will. Sometimes other ones will have different results. So I go down here, I find ones that look interesting. Some of these are not going to be as interesting. As you go and you look down, sometimes you'll see things that aren't interesting. This one, a supplement with synephrine. I don't care. I don't know what synephrine is. Let's forget about that. Sprint performance, this one probably is going to be useful. so this gives you an idea. There's actually a lot of interesting things here. When you're going to look for oat bran, you're probably going to do a similar thing. And as you read articles or read the abstracts, you're going to usually find words that are going to help you find other things that are interesting, because usually you find keywords as you read articles that are relevant to what you're interested in. If I wanted to do, how about green tea and health? This is another thing I've had students look at. Tea polyphenols and promotion of human health. Here's something. Anti-inflammatory actions of green tea. Here's a review of the role of green tea and stress resistance. So this would probably be useful. So again, you're going down here and finding things that are interesting and taking a look at them. Effects of a probiotic in green tea mouth rinse on salivary pH. If you're going to be more about just like health of green tea, probably we're not interested in this one. So just to give you a sense, in PubMed, you can find all sorts of cool stuff. Once you click on it, usually it gives you an abstract, which tells you the summary of what they found. For your homework, you don't need anything more than just the summary. When you're writing things and getting your results, don't worry about going into the entire paper. This abstract will be enough for what you need to know. Even later, it's usually enough, but I will show you ways to get full texts and stuff when you need to and it's not free. This thing, site, this is important. This is actually, I didn't know it existed here now. It exists in PubMed as well. It exists in Google Scholar. If I click on there, it shows you, it kind of formats it, because when you are using references in your paper, at the end, you have to say, these are all the references I cited. There are AMA, MLA, APA. So this is probably, actually they don't have the Harvard one. This one actually is pretty much the closest to the Harvard one, and this National Library of Medicine. If you're in Google Scholar, Google Scholar actually is a good place to find stuff as well. Let's say I was going to look at red wine and health. And I found, inhibition of, where is it? Inhibition of calcium activated chloride channels by gallotannins is a possible molecular basis for health benefits of red wine and green tea. Again, here we have a nice abstract so you can see what it says. But one of the things that I like about the Google Scholar, if you go down to where it has this little thing that looks like little quotes, and you click on it, there's the Harvard referencing. You could just cut and paste this into your paper, and that will have the reference in the proper form for the Harvard referencing that we're going to do.
So you don't want APA?
No. Most of the scientific stuff done is with this inline Harvard referencing. So for instance, like I can show you, if we go on to
Professor, have you used the link that I put in the chat? It's pretty awesome.
I haven't seen the chat yet. Let me see. Oh, so yeah, so I want to be careful about, so I'm not going to specifically advertise it because I don't want to get into trouble, but you should check out what it is for sure. That's what I would say. Yeah, so it's kind of a crowdsourced way of accessing PDFs, even if they are not accessible through typical. Let's see, coming back to modules, here we are. Here we are. Okay, so this is published here. I have search, oh, I didn't publish it. Publish, publish, publish. It's now published. Searching the literature, I just kind of talk a little bit about the idea of what I've just been talking about now. Next, I talk about Harvard referencing, which is this way of doing inline references. So whenever you mention something that's not common knowledge that needs a reference, you need to put a reference. So like, for instance, I'm saying here, let's say I was doing a paper on MDMA assisted psychotherapy. And one of the things is I'm referencing a study that has to do with MDMA and PTSD patients. You know, MDMA administered along with psychotherapy controlled settings have been shown to be effective at reducing PTSD symptoms in veterans and first responders. So that's information that I got from looking at a study, but then I can't just leave it there. I have to say, what study was it? And the study is, you always do the author and the year. If it's more than one author, you just do the first author and et al. And then at the end of the paper, you have the list of your references. So, you know, this is the formal reference. Midhofer, this is actually Michael and Annie Midhofer. There's two Midhofers and Ali Fiducia. And so it's all of these people here. And here's the actual name of the article. This was the journal it was published in. This is like the volume and the pages. You know, so in your homework, which is going to be, you know, basically trying to decide whether the scientific literature supports whether Quaker oats helps with your heart health. You know, you need to go do some research and use PubMed. You can use Google Scholar as well. And again, you don't need the full text of the article. If you just use the abstract, that will be enough to get the information you need to write this. Should be short. I wrote here, this should be no longer than a page or so. This is not supposed to be something that is, but can you see this still?
Yeah.
Okay, this is just supposed to be about getting used to searching the literature. This is not a term paper, right? This is, it says you should use like a minimum of 4 references, though it shouldn't be longer than a page, and kind of summarize what did you find and make sure you document your findings by using references. But again, this isn't, you are going to do a more involved research paper later on in the semester, but this is more about just getting your feet wet in looking at stuff in the literature. So does that make sense?
So for the summary, do you want us to have citations?
Yes, the summary should have, the citations should be in this Harvard referencing. Like, let me show you. Hello, we're running out of time. Blah, blah, blah. Let me find. Okay, here, let's do this. I'm going to share another thing with you all. Okay, so here, this will be fascinating. So this, can you see this? Do you see a screen on here? So this Bruno, this is a guy actually we collaborated with trying to figure out how to do our compassion tasks and stuff. You know, he studies how people how they treat each other and how they have trouble finding compassion for each other. And here he's like, you know, talking about, you know, prior neuroimaging research has identified a group of brain regions robustly recruited when people think about someone else's thoughts and beliefs. And then here are the studies. Kira Murindaro et al. 2007, Gallagher et al. 2000, Gubini et al. 2007. You know, blah, blah, blah. He keeps going, for example, in white participants, activity in the fusiform face area in a region involved in face perception is lower when viewing black than white faces, Golby et al. You know, some of these studies are, you know, people see other groups' ideological views as ignorant, biased, or irrational, Erlinger et al. So these people actually did studies where they document. It's not just like, I think that's the case. They actually do a study and try to figure this kind of stuff out. You know, individuals motivated by social dominance can be less caring of others and legitimize exploitive behaviors. You know, Sedanius Prado, 2004. You know, people, even though it's like, oh, it sounds like, oh, it kind of makes sense in my, you can't just say it. You have to say, like, where is the actual evidence? It's not just like logically makes sense, but did someone do a study where they try to document this in some way that, so that's, you know, and at the end of any of these papers, you have to have the list of references. Anything that you reference like that has to be in this list of references. So does that make sense?
It's the author and the year.
Yeah, it's that Harvard referencing thing, which again, if you want, it's the author, but here it has all the authors. And then it has the title. And again, Appendix C in your lab manual talks about it. I put some links in the, if we go back to, oh yeah, if you just Google Harvard referencing, you'll find lots of things that will help with it. And again, this isn't due for, when is this due? I made it due.
On the 27th.
Yeah, so on next Tuesday, I will spend a little more time giving you examples of the how the references look, because I'm realizing we're running out of time.